In 1983, a long-haul truck driver vanished without a trace on a routine delivery. Then, 12 years later, his burnt-out rig is discovered in a forgotten salvage yard, and inside its scorched shell lies the trail of hidden roots, shadow cargo, and buried secrets that reveal the dark truth of what really happened on the open road. The winter sun hung low over the salvage yard, its weak light catching on twisted heaps of rusted metal and forgotten machines. Fire crews had been called to extinguish a flare-up from a pile of wreckage pushed into a corner years ago, a smoldering reminder of storms and accidents that had ended lives long before. When the smoke cleared, what remained in the ashes caught their attention: the charred frame of a red and silver semi-truck, its cab warped and blackened but still identifiable beneath layers of soot. It should have been just another burned-out husk in a yard full of them, but one detail made it different. The VIN plate, though scorched, was still intact. When an officer ran the numbers, he froze. The truck belonged to John Ward, a driver who had vanished on a delivery route in the spring of 1983. For 12 years, his disappearance had hung like a cloud over his family, a mystery that no investigation had managed to solve. The case had gone cold, the memory of him fading into whispers among other drivers who said the road had swallowed him whole. As investigators climbed into the cab, the air was thick with the acrid stench of old fire and damp metal. On the passenger side, wedged between the melted remains of the glove compartment and the seat springs, they found something unexpected. A battered leather logbook, its cover scorched, but its pages inside still mostly intact. The edges were curled and blackened, but the ink was visible, neat lines of handwritten notes recording John's miles, stops, and routes. Some pages contained shorthand remarks, fragments of thoughts, even names scrawled quickly in the margins. The discovery sent a ripple through the small team standing around the rig. For years, all they had were theories. Some believed John had run off, leaving his family behind. Others whispered about theft, smuggling, or backroads dangers too dark to name aloud. But this logbook suggested he had left a trail, a record of his last days, preserved against all odds inside a machine thought to be lost forever. The yard fell silent as the book was lifted carefully into evidence bags. The blackened truck loomed behind them, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. After 12 years of silence, John Ward's story was stirring again, and it was clear the logbook would not just reopen the case, it would force them to confront truths that had been buried with the ashes of the rig. News of the discovery reached Daniel Ward before dawn, carried by a phone call that shook him out of uneasy sleep. The voice on the other end belonged to a sheriff's deputy, hesitant as he explained that John Ward's rig had been located in a salvage yard miles from anywhere Daniel had expected. For a moment, the words barely registered. His father had been gone for 12 years, his absence a wound that never quite healed. Hearing his name spoken in connection with something tangible felt like the ground giving way beneath him. By mid-morning, Daniel was standing at the edge of the salvage yard, the smell of smoke and scorched steel still hanging heavy in the cold air. His breath came out in pale clouds as he stared at the wreck. The semi was barely recognizable, its once bright red cab caved in and blackened, chrome stripped away by fire and time. Yet beneath the ruin, he saw traces of the man he had lost, the truck his father had polished on weekends, the machine that had carried him across endless highways. A detective guided him closer, pointing to the evidence bag resting on a hood nearby. Inside lay the logbook, warped but strangely defiant against the destruction. Daniel's throat tightened as he stared at the familiar handwriting curling across the pages. As a boy, he had often watched his father sit at the kitchen table, jotting numbers and notes in that same neat script. To see it again, after so many years, was like seeing a ghost. The detective explained that some of the entries didn't match official records. John had written down stops, not listed on his delivery route, strange shorthand notes that seemed personal but also coded. There were dates, times, and place names that raised more questions than answers. Daniel barely heard him. His eyes were locked on a page where his father had scrawled something in heavier strokes, as if writing quickly under pressure. It was a name Daniel didn't recognize, circled twice. The wreck, the logbook, the sudden reappearance of his father's world, it all pressed in on him at once. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope, though it was tangled with dread. The past had resurfaced, and it demanded to be followed. Whatever truth had burned with that truck had not been fully destroyed, and now it was calling him into the mystery his father had left behind. Daniel sat at the sheriff's office later that afternoon, the logbook spread open across a table under the harsh fluorescent lights. The edges of the pages were brittle, the faint scent of smoke clinging to them, but the words inside were unmistakably his father's. The steady lines of neat handwriting carried the weight of familiarity, the voice of a man Daniel had only known through fading memories and stories his mother told. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, explaining what little they knew. John Ward had vanished in May of 1983 while hauling a standard delivery across state lines. The last official record placed him at a way station 2 hours from home. After that, nothing. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no recovery of the truck. Over the years, theories piled up like rust on forgotten metal. Some said John had skipped town, unable to keep up with the long hours and endless bills. Others whispered about highway thieves, smuggling, or debts he couldn't repay. With no proof, the case had quietly dissolved into silence. But now the logbook had given them something different. Several entries noted stops along back roads and small towns that weren't on his assigned route. One entry in particular was jarring, dated just a day before he disappeared. It read simply, 87 marker, last chance, scrawled hastily in darker ink as if written in a hurry. Next to it was a name neither Daniel nor the sheriff recognized, circled twice like it mattered more than anything else on the page. Daniel traced the ink with his finger, his chest tightening. It felt less like notes for the job and more like a message, one meant to be found if something went wrong. He tried to picture his father sitting in the cab late at night, pen scratching across paper, knowing he might not return. The sheriff promised they would re-examine the file, see if the strange place names matched old maps or forgotten stops along John's route. But Daniel was already thinking ahead. For 12 years, he had lived with the ache of not knowing, of hearing his father's absence explained away by rumors and speculation. Now, with these pages in front of him, he finally had something tangible, something alive with possibility. The logbook wasn't just evidence, it was an invitation. His father had left a trail, and Daniel knew he had no choice but to follow where it led. The next morning, Daniel set out with the logbook writing shotgun on the seat beside him, its pages marked with sticky notes where entries had stood out the night before. The winter air was crisp and the sky clear, the kind of morning that might have once tempted his father to roll the windows down and let the open road wash over him. For Daniel, though, the drive was heavy with purpose. He was heading toward the old rest stop noted twice in the logbook, a place his father had gone out of his way to mention but never explained. The highway unfurled in long gray ribbons, empty but for the occasional semi-hauling goods across state lines. Each one stirred something in him. The memory of riding in his father's cab as a boy, the low rumble of the engine steady beneath his feet. He remembered the thermos of black coffee John always carried, the way he would tap the wheel in rhythm with songs on the radio, a man in command of both his truck and his world. It was difficult to reconcile that memory with the reality of the burnt-out rig, rusting away in a salvage yard, and the frantic scrawl of words left behind. When Daniel finally pulled off the highway, the rest stop appeared like a ghost of another era. The gas pumps were gone, their bases overgrown with weeds, and the bathrooms were boarded up, the brick walls tagged with layers of graffiti. He parked near the cracked picnic tables and stepped out, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots echoing in the empty lot. The place smelled of old wood and damp earth, as if the world had forgotten it existed. He walked slowly, scanning the ground and the structures for anything that might explain why his father had written about this place. It was only when he circled around the back of the restroom building that he noticed its faint lettering etched into the brick, weathered but still legible. Someone had carved the name Ward into the wall, followed by the year 1983. Daniel stood frozen, his breath catching. It could have been a cruel coincidence, but deep down he knew it wasn't. His father had been here, had left his mark, and for reasons Daniel was only beginning to understand, he had wanted someone to find it. Daniel ran his fingertips across the weathered brick, tracing the letters of his father's name. The grooves were shallow, the work of a pocket knife or maybe a key, but deliberate enough to last through years of rain and sun. The date beneath it, 1983, struck him like a cold hand around his chest. His father had been here. This wasn't just a passing stop scribbled in a logbook. It was a place where John had paused long enough to leave a message. He stepped back and scanned the area again, his breath visible in the cool morning air. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the occasional hum of a truck passing far off on the highway. A lone crow perched on the roof of the restroom building, tilting its head as if watching him. Daniel wondered if anyone else had ever noticed the carving or if it had waited all these years for him alone. Inside his car, he flipped the logbook open and compared the date carved into the wall with the entries on the same page. The times matched. That night in May, his father had stopped here, written it down twice, and left a mark in stone. Next to it in the book, hastily scribbled in the margin, was the word wrong. Just that, no explanation. The ink was darker, more jagged than the rest, as though written in haste or frustration. Daniel took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. Wrong load, wrong route, wrong people. The word carried too much weight to be a mistake. His father had been warning himself or leaving a signal for anyone who might one day look. Before leaving, Daniel took photos of the carving and the surrounding area, every angle he could capture. He lingered at the rest stop longer than he meant to, feeling the presence of the past pressing against him before finally starting the car. As he pulled back onto the highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the trail was becoming more personal with every mile. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a conversation across time, his father speaking in fragments and clues, and Daniel determined to answer. The rest stop had given him proof. Now, he had to find the reason behind it. Daniel drove for miles with the logbook open on the passenger seat, glancing at the notes his father had written as if the pages themselves could guide him. The carving at the rest stop weighed heavy in his mind. His father had stopped there intentionally, marked his presence, and left behind that single word wrong. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a breadcrumb in a trail that had been waiting for him for over a decade. He pulled into a roadside diner near the county line, the kind of place truckers had relied on for decades. The neon sign flickered in the early afternoon light, and the smell of fried food and strong coffee wrapped around him as he stepped inside. The counter was lined with men in heavy jackets and worn caps, their conversations low and steady. Daniel chose a booth near the window, spreading the photocopied pages across the table. When the waitress came by, she noticed the logbook. Her eyes lingered on the handwriting before she set down his coffee. "Haven't seen one of those in a long time," she said softly. "My daddy used to keep his just the same way." Daniel hesitated before asking if she remembered the name John Ward. The words barely left his mouth before her expression shifted. She nodded slowly, glancing around the diner as if to make sure no one was listening. "I was young, but I remember folks talking. He came through here, back in '83, sat in that very booth." She tapped the tabletop with her hand. "Said he wasn't feeling right about his load, something about being followed." Daniel leaned in, his pulse quickening. "Do you remember who he was with?" The woman frowned, searching her memory. "There was another driver, but he didn't stay long. Left before your father did. People whispered after he disappeared, said it wasn't just bad luck. Some folks figured he got caught up in things too big for one man." She didn't know more, but it was enough to confirm what Daniel already felt in his bones. His father had known something was wrong with that last haul. He hadn't been running away, hadn't abandoned his family. He had been afraid. And someone had been close enough to see it happen. Daniel folded the pages carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. As he left the diner, the sense of unease that had followed him since the salvage yard grew sharper. If his father had been followed then, maybe Daniel was being watched now. That night, Daniel checked into a roadside motel, the kind with flickering vacancy signs and curtains that never quite closed. He laid the logbook on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, the day's discoveries looping through his mind. His father had been here, in these same towns, on these same roads, and he had known he was in danger. The carving at the rest stop, the waitress remembering his unease, the words scrawled in the margins, it all pointed to a man trying to leave behind a warning. Unable to sleep, Daniel spread the logbook open again. One page near the back caught his attention. It listed mileage and fuel stops like the others, but in the corner his father had written a series of initials, J.M. Checkload. The letters meant nothing to Daniel, yet they were underlined twice, the ink pressed harder into the page, as if his father had wanted to make sure they were not overlooked. He stared at them until exhaustion finally pulled him under. His sleep was restless, filled with images of the burnt-out rig smoldering in the salvage yard, his father's voice calling to him from the smoke. When he awoke at dawn, the sense of urgency was sharper than ever. Whoever J.M. was, he might be the next piece of the puzzle. After breakfast, Daniel drove back to the sheriff's office and asked about the initials. The sheriff thumbed through old records and finally leaned back in his chair. There was a dispatcher around that time, Jim Mathers. Retired in the late 80s. Some said he had ties to the wrong kind of people, though nothing was ever proven. The name hit Daniel like a jolt. If his father had written it in the logbook, Mathers wasn't just another name. He was connected to that last run, maybe even the reason John knew something was wrong. Leaving the office, Daniel felt the weight of the road ahead. Mathers was out there somewhere, old now but still alive. If he could be found, he might finally reveal what his father had stumbled into. The initials in the logbook were no longer just ink on paper. They were a direction, and Daniel knew he had no choice but to follow. Daniel spent the better part of the afternoon combing through old phone directories and county records, trying to track down Jim Mathers. The dispatcher's name popped up in faded trucking company rosters from the early 80s, but after his retirement in 1987, he seemed to have vanished. It wasn't until a clerk at the courthouse suggested he check voter rolls that Daniel found a lead, a small property on the outskirts of a neighboring county listed under the same name. The drive there carried a heaviness Daniel couldn't shake. The roads twisted through farmland where barns leaned tiredly against the horizon and mailboxes were bent with rust. He wondered if Mathers had been living quietly all these years, the secrets of those long nights on the road buried with him in the silence of retirement. Or had he been hiding, knowing that someone might one day come looking for answers? When Daniel finally pulled up the gravel drive, the house looked worn but lived in, its porch sagging under the weight of time. A wind chime clattered in the breeze, and the faint glow of a television flickered behind the curtains. Daniel knocked once, then again. After a long pause, the door opened a crack, revealing an older man with thinning hair and eyes sharp despite his years. "I'm not buying anything," Mathers muttered, his voice rough. Daniel introduced himself, mentioning John Ward's name. At that, the man froze, the door still half closed. His eyes flicked to Daniel's face, searching, calculating. "Haven't heard that name in a long time," he said finally, his tone carrying something between regret and warning. Daniel explained about the burnt-out rig and the logbook recovered inside. He mentioned the initials, J.M., underlined twice in his father's final entries. For a moment, Mathers said nothing, his hand still gripping the edge of the door. Then he sighed, opening it wider. "You better come in," he said quietly, "but you won't like what you're about to hear." Daniel stepped across the threshold, the air inside thick with the smell of old tobacco and stale coffee. As the door shut behind him, he felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. After 12 years of silence, one of the men tied to his father's last journey was ready to talk. The living room was dim, curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun, the air heavy with the lingering smell of cigarettes. Jim Mathers lowered himself into an old recliner and gestured for Daniel to take the couch. For a long moment the older man said nothing, his eyes fixed on the muted television screen as though he were weighing every word before it left his mouth. "I knew your father," he said finally, his voice low and uneven. "John was a good driver, one of the best we had, reliable. Straightforward, that was his problem. He didn't bend easy." Mathers rubbed a hand over his face and leaned back. "Back then there were shipments moving that weren't exactly in the books. Things I didn't ask too many questions about because I knew better. But your father," he asked questions. Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What kind of shipments?" Mathers' gaze flicked toward him, then away. "Cash, sometimes. Other times, crates with no manifest. Everyone knew not to pry. Those loads came from people higher up than dispatch, people you didn't cross if you valued your life. John was assigned one of those runs in May of '83. I told him to just keep his head down and deliver, but he wasn't the type to ignore a bad feeling." He paused, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water. "He called me from a payphone that night. Said he thought he was being followed. Said the weight on his truck didn't match the papers. He asked me what I knew about it. I told him nothing, because that was the truth. Then he said something I'll never forget. 'If I don't make it back, remember this load.'" Daniel felt his chest tighten, the words landing like a blow. His father had known even then that the road ahead might not bring him home. Mathers lowered his voice to a whisper. "Not long after, the word came down that his rig had gone missing. Everyone acted like it was nothing unusual, but I knew better. They didn't want that shipment questioned, and John made the mistake of questioning it." Silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the television. Mathers looked at Daniel, his expression weary but resolute. "Your father didn't run away. He found something he wasn't supposed to, and someone made sure it disappeared along with him." Daniel sat in the silence of Mathers's living room, the hum of the old television filling the space between them. He felt a chill despite the stale warmth of the room, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of unspoken truths. Mathers stared into his glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as he set it back on the table. "You need to understand something," Mathers said, his voice hoarse. "Back then, the trucking world wasn't just freight and deliveries. There were runs nobody talked about, routes that never showed up in company books. Drivers were told to shut their mouths and do the job. Most did, but not your father. He was honest, maybe too honest for his own good." Daniel's pulse quickened as he pulled the photocopied pages of the logbook from his envelope and slid them across the table. This was in his truck. "Do you recognize the name he circled? The one next to the mile marker?" Mathers leaned forward, his glasses slipping down his nose as he studied the page. His eyes lingered on the ink, and he let out a slow breath. "I haven't seen that name in years." It belonged to a man who acted as a middleman, not a driver, not a dispatcher. Someone who made sure the loads that weren't supposed to exist found their way to where they needed to go. Dangerous type, the kind of man who made problems disappear. Daniel felt the room close in on him. "Are you saying he's the one who—" Mathers cut him off, his eyes sharp now. "I'm saying your father crossed paths with him. If John figured out what was really in that truck, if he said something he shouldn't have, then yes, that man would have made sure he never said another word." The weight of the revelation pressed against Daniel's chest, but beneath the fear, he felt something else: clarity. His father hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't simply vanished into thin air. He had stumbled into something dark and paid the price for his integrity. Mathers sat back heavily, his voice almost a whisper. "You want answers, son, but digging deeper will put a target on your back. The men who ran those routes may be old now, but some things don't stay buried. You think you're chasing the past, but the past has a way of chasing you too." Daniel drove away from Mathers' house with his hands clenched tight around the steering wheel, the older man's warning echoing in his ears. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in muted shades of orange, but instead of calming him, the fading light only sharpened his unease. For 12 years, he had lived with a hole in his life, filled with half-truths and rumors about his father's disappearance. Now, for the first time, there was a shape to that absence. His father had uncovered something he was never meant to see, and it had cost him everything. At a gas station on the edge of town, Daniel stopped to clear his head. He leaned against the hood of his car while the pump clicked away, his eyes scanning the lot without really thinking. A sedan idling by the air machine caught his attention. Its windows were tinted too dark for a small-town vehicle, and the driver never got out. When Daniel looked directly at it, the engine revved and the car pulled away, tires crunching on gravel. A chill rippled through him. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. But Mathers's words about the past chasing him suddenly felt less like a warning and more like prophecy. Back in the car, Daniel unfolded the logbook again. His father's neat script stared back at him, and his eyes fixed on the entry beside the mile marker, "Last chance." The words felt heavier now, as though John had known that moment was his final opportunity to make things right or leave a clue behind. Daniel traced the letters with his fingertip, imagining his father sitting in the cab of his truck, pen scratching on paper while shadows closed in around him. He couldn't let it go. Mathers had pointed him toward a middleman, a shadow figure who orchestrated the shipments and silenced questions. If that man's name had been circled in the logbook, then he was the next step in the trail. Daniel didn't know if the man was still alive, or if chasing him would put his own life at risk, but he felt a resolve settle deep within him. His father hadn't quit, hadn't abandoned his family. He had been fighting until the very end. As night fell and the highway stretched ahead in darkness, Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. Whatever waited at the end of this road, he owed it to his father to see it through. The following morning, Daniel found himself back at the county library, hunched over reels of microfilm and yellowed newspapers that smelled faintly of mildew. His father's logbook had given him a name, one circled and underlined with urgency, and now he searched for it in records that most people had long forgotten. Hours passed with nothing but lists of small-town events, grain prices, and truck advertisements until a single headline caught his eye. Buried in a local paper from 1982 was a brief mention of a warehouse foreman by the same name, arrested in connection with stolen goods moving through a freight depot. The charges had been dropped weeks later, the case dismissed without explanation, but Daniel knew immediately that this was the man his father had feared. He scribbled the address of the old depot into his notebook and drove out toward the edge of town. The building still stood, its windows broken, weeds pushing through the cracked asphalt lot. The faded sign above the loading bays had long since lost its letters, but Daniel felt an unmistakable pull as he stepped from the car. His father's last route had taken him past this very stretch of road. He walked slowly, peering into the shadowed bays where rusted pallets and broken crates lay scattered like relics of a forgotten trade. Inside, dust hung in the air, glowing in shafts of light that cut through the holes in the roof. Daniel's footsteps echoed as he explored the empty space, his eyes tracing the outlines of what once had been busy docks. Near the back, he noticed faint markings on the concrete floor, old tire tracks preserved beneath years of dust. They were the wide, heavy imprints of a semi, too deliberate to be chance. His chest tightened as he crouched, brushing his hand across them. He could almost imagine his father's truck parked there, engine idling, the logbook open on the dash as he weighed whether to continue or to turn back. The silence of the place was thick, almost suffocating, but Daniel felt more certain than ever that he was standing in the footprint of his father's last journey. The circled name in the logbook was not just a note, it was a signal pointing here, to this forgotten warehouse where something had gone very wrong. As he stepped back into the sunlight, Daniel realized the trail was no longer abstract. It had become real, etched into the ground beneath his feet, and it was waiting for him to follow. Daniel stood in the parking lot of the abandoned depot, the brittle wind tugging at his jacket as he tried to steady his thoughts. The building loomed behind him, hollow and skeletal, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing in the exact place where his father had realized the scope of what he had been pulled into. The logbook entry, the word "wrong," the circled name, All of it pointed here. He drove into town and stopped at a diner that seemed unchanged since the 80s, chrome trim dulled by years, but still catching the afternoon light. Inside, he asked the waitress if she remembered anything about the warehouse when it was still in operation. At first, she shook her head, but when Daniel mentioned his father's name, her expression changed. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "I remember hearing talk back then. That depot wasn't just shipping furniture like the sign said. People whispered about trucks coming through at odd hours, carrying loads that were never on the books. And your father," he came through here once, tired looking, "asked me if I'd seen a man with a scar above his eyebrow. He left in a hurry, not long after." The detail pierced Daniel. A scar. It could have been the middleman Mathers had hinted at, the man who made problems disappear. The waitress didn't recall more, but the image was already seared into Daniel's mind. His father had been searching for answers too, perhaps already sensing the danger pressing in. After leaving the diner, Daniel drove slowly past the depot again. The empty lot glowed faintly in the setting sun, long shadows stretching across the cracked asphalt. He imagined his father's rig rolling in under cover of night, headlights off, cargo weighing heavy in the trailer. Somewhere inside that building, his father had seen or heard something that made him scratch those words into his logbook and carve his name into a wall miles away. Daniel parked on the shoulder and sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the decaying structure. He knew this wasn't the end of the trail, it was only another threshold. His father had left him enough to keep moving, and Daniel understood now with a clarity that sent a shiver down his spine. The truth wasn't buried in stories or rumors. It was hidden in places like this, waiting for him to uncover it, no matter how dangerous it became. The following day, Daniel returned to the depot with a flashlight and a determination that unsettled even him. The morning was gray, clouds pressing low, the air carrying the metallic bite of coming rain. He parked his car well off the road, not wanting to draw attention, and stepped through the wide loading bay doors. The inside smelled of damp wood and rust, the silence punctuated only by the steady drip of water somewhere deep within. Dust coated everything, but Daniel noticed signs of disturbance. In one corner, the concrete floor was scuffed, as if crates had been dragged across it long after the building was abandoned. He crouched, running his fingers over the faint marks, feeling the weight of invisible history pressing down. His father had been here, perhaps standing in this very spot, deciding whether to walk away or keep pushing. He followed the scuffs to a stack of broken pallets leaning against the wall. Behind them, almost hidden from view, was a patch of floor darker than the rest, a square outline etched into the concrete. He tapped it with the toe of his boot and heard a hollow echo. Kneeling, he brushed away years of grime to reveal a trapdoor of sorts, a wooden cover reinforced with rusting metal hinges. His pulse quickened as he pulled it open, revealing a narrow crawl space below. The air that rushed out was stale, filled with the scent of old oil and something acrid that stung his throat. Shining his flashlight inside, Daniel saw the skeletal remains of crates stacked neatly in rows. Most were empty, their contents long gone, but stenciled letters were still faintly visible on the wood. They didn't spell out company names or product descriptions, but simple codes, strings of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him but reeked of secrecy. In the corner of the hidden space lay something smaller, a metal clipboard scorched along its edges. Daniel reached for it, wiping away dust until the handwriting came into view. It wasn't his father's, but the notes described shipments, times, and drivers. Among the names listed, one jumped out at him: John Ward. Daniel lowered the clipboard slowly, his breath unsteady. This was no coincidence. His father had been singled out, recorded in lists that tied him directly to whatever operation ran through this depot. It was proof that his disappearance wasn't chance. Someone had marked him, and someone had made sure he never came home. Daniel drove back to town with the clipboard on the passenger seat, the weight of it far greater than its rusted frame suggested. The rain had started to fall in steady sheets, streaking across the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. His thoughts spun in circles. The logbook had raised questions, but this clipboard confirmed something darker. His father had been recorded in the ledgers of a hidden operation, his name listed among drivers who were more than likely carrying freight no one was meant to talk about. At his mother's kitchen table that evening, Daniel laid out the clipboard beside the photocopied logbook pages. The lamp cast a yellow glow over the documents, the handwriting casting jagged shadows on the paper. His mother sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression grim. "I knew he was tired of it," she said quietly. "Not the driving, not the long nights. He loved that part. But the company was changing. He said more than once that there were things he didn't trust anymore." She looked at the clipboard with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "He must have been caught between doing the right thing and protecting us." Daniel listened, the pieces clicking together in his mind. His father had not been a man who walked away. He had been a man who tried to push back, who left small signals in a logbook and a name carved into a wall, hoping they might one day be seen. And now, sitting here 12 years later, Daniel was beginning to see the shape of the truth. Later, he spread the documents out again alone, studying the names that appeared alongside his father's. Some had been crossed out with thick lines of ink, while others were marked with numbers that looked like coded roots. He circled them, writing notes in the margins. The pattern wasn't clear yet, but it was there, waiting to be unraveled. When he finally stepped outside for air, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the glow of the street lamps. He stood on the porch, listening to the night. A pair of headlights rolled slowly past the house, moving too deliberately for his comfort. Daniel felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. The past wasn't just revealing itself, someone else was watching as he followed it. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's name written in unfamiliar handwriting on that scorched clipboard, a man reduced to a line item in someone else's ledger. The sound of tires on wet pavement echoed in his memory too, that slow car crawling past the house, its headlight slicing through the curtains as if reminding him he was not alone in his search. By dawn, exhaustion had set in, but the determination in his chest only grew sharper. He decided to return to the sheriff with what he had found. The deputy at the front desk eyed the clipboard skeptically before waving him back to the office. The sheriff studied the document with a furrowed brow, running a calloused finger over the smudged handwriting. "If this is real," he muttered, "it's bigger than anything we looked at in '83. The feds should have had this years ago." Daniel leaned forward, his voice tight. "It was buried under that depot. Someone wanted it hidden. My father's name is in there. That's proof he was part of whatever they were moving, whether he wanted to be or not." The sheriff nodded slowly, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "Evidence like this doesn't just disappear without help. If people high up wanted your father gone, digging deeper is going to put you in the same danger he was in." The words stung because Daniel already knew them to be true. Yet as he looked at the clipboard lying between them, he felt no urge to back away. His father hadn't left his family willingly. He had been silenced. Allowing that silence to continue would mean surrendering to the same forces that had taken him. On his way out of the station, Daniel noticed a man leaning against a sedan across the street, smoking a cigarette. Their eyes met for only a second before the man turned, flicking the cigarette to the ground and slipping into the car. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, disappearing into traffic, but Daniel's pulse quickened. Whoever was tied to this, they knew the past was stirring. He gripped the wheel of his car until his knuckles whitened. For 12 years, his father's disappearance had been treated as a mystery too cold to solve. Now Daniel understood that the truth had never gone cold at all. It had been kept on ice, waiting for someone willing to thaw it out. Daniel drove aimlessly for a while after leaving the sheriff's office, the late afternoon sun bleeding into the horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of fading orange and deepening purple. His thoughts circled like restless birds, never settling. He couldn't shake the image of the man across the street, smoking and watching, then slipping into that sedan. It was too deliberate to be chance. The trail he was following was no longer just about uncovering the past, it was pressing into the present, and whoever had buried the truth seemed intent on keeping it there. He pulled into a rest stop off the highway, the same kind of place his father would have used on long hauls. Trucks rumbled in and out, headlights cutting through the dusk, engines humming like a chorus of distant thunder. Daniel parked at the edge of the lot and pulled the logbook onto his lap. His father's notes had begun to take on a rhythm, a pattern he hadn't noticed before. The same town circled again and again, the same mile markers recorded with an almost obsessive precision. One town in particular appeared more than the rest, a place called Pine Hollow, small enough that Daniel had never heard of it, but written down 3 times in the final week before his father vanished. He traced the entries with his finger, his chest tightening. Why would his father return to the same small town on multiple runs if it wasn't part of the official route? The answer was written between the lines. Whatever John Ward had stumbled upon, it had roots there. The highway lights flickered on, bathing the lot in a pale glow as Daniel made his decision. He turned the ignition, the engine rumbling to life, and set his course toward Pine Hollow. The map showed it tucked off the interstate, surrounded by dense forest and winding back roads that could easily hide more than they revealed. As he drove into the night, the empty road stretching before him, Daniel felt the weight of both fear and clarity pressing down on him. His father hadn't left random clues in a logbook. He had built a trail, carefully, deliberately. Pine Hollow wasn't just another stop on a route. It was the place where the answers waited, and maybe the place where John Ward had met his end. Pine Hollow emerged from the dark like a place that had been forgotten by time. Daniel followed the faded signs off the interstate and onto a narrow 2-lane road that wound through thick forest before spilling into a quiet main street. Most of the storefronts were shuttered, their paint peeling, old signs hanging crooked above dusty windows. A single gas station stood at the edge of town, its neon sign buzzing faintly, the only pulse of life in the quiet night. He pulled into the lot and shut off the engine, sitting for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel. The logbook lay open on the passenger seat, his father's handwriting looping steadily across the page. Pine Hollow had been written 3 times in the week before John disappeared, the entries marked with an urgency that Daniel could feel even now. Whatever business had brought his father here, it wasn't chance. Inside the gas station, the air smelled of motor oil and stale coffee. A man in his 60s stood behind the counter, his cap pulled low over his brow. When Daniel asked if he remembered a driver named John Ward from back in the early 80s, the man's eyes flicked up sharply. For a moment he said nothing, then busied himself straightening a stack of newspapers that didn't need straightening. "I remember him," the man said finally, his voice flat. "Came through here a few times, always polite, always looked like he had something on his mind." He paused, his hands stilling on the counter. "Last time I saw him, he wasn't alone. Another fella came in with him, scar above his right eyebrow. Didn't say much, but he watched John close, like a man watching his dog on a leash." The description made Daniel's pulse quicken. The waitress at the diner had mentioned the same scar. Whoever that man was, he had been shadowing his father. "Never saw your dad again after that night," the attendant added. "Couple days later, folks were saying a driver went missing. Some around here weren't surprised." Daniel pressed for more, but the man only shook his head, his eyes drifting nervously to the window as if afraid someone might be listening. Daniel left with little more than confirmation of what he already knew: his father had been here, and he hadn't been alone. Pine Hollow wasn't just another mark in a logbook, it was a place where the walls had ears, and fear still lingered in the quiet corners of town. Daniel walked out of the gas station with the cold night pressing down on him, his breath fogging in the air as he tried to steady his thoughts. The man behind the counter hadn't said much, but the mention of the scarred stranger shadowing his father gnawed at him. That figure was no longer just rumor. He had been real, close enough to follow John Ward into a small-town gas station, close enough to make sure he never came home. Daniel drove slowly through Pine Hollow, the streets nearly deserted. A lone bar with neon lights flickering in the window was the only place still open. He parked outside and stepped in, the smell of smoke and beer enveloping him as the door creaked shut behind him. The handful of patrons turned briefly before returning to their drinks, their conversations quiet and watchful. He took a seat at the bar and ordered a coffee, trying to blend in, though he could feel eyes lingering on him. After a while, he pulled the logbook from his jacket and opened it on the counter, tracing the entries that had brought him here. The bartender, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, noticed. "That's no tourist guide," she said dryly, setting his cup down. Daniel hesitated before answering. "My father was a driver. He wrote this before he disappeared. Pine Hollow shows up more than once." The bartender's expression flickered, guarded but not dismissive. She leaned closer, her voice low. "If your father was here in the early 80s, then he wasn't just passing through. Back then, trucks rolled into the depot outside town at all hours. Folks knew better than to ask what was inside. Men with scars, men with guns, this wasn't a place you lingered if you valued your skin." Daniel felt the words sink into him, confirming what he already feared. His father hadn't wandered into danger by mistake. He had been swallowed by it, pulled into something that reached far beyond one small town. The bartender straightened and glanced toward a man playing pool at the back of the room. "You should be careful digging into this," she said, her tone suddenly harder. "Some of the people who ran those roads are still around, and they don't like old ghosts being stirred." Daniel closed the logbook quietly, the weight of her warning heavy. Pine Hollow wasn't just a waypoint. It was the crossroads where his father's story had turned, and he was now standing in the same shadows. Daniel lingered in the bar longer than he meant to, sipping at coffee that had long gone cold. The low hum of conversation carried around him, punctuated by the clatter of pool balls and the occasional bark of laughter, but beneath it all ran a tension he couldn't ignore. The bartender's warning had struck something deep. Pine Hollow wasn't a place for strangers to ask questions, and the scarred men who once moved freight through this town weren't just stories whispered in truck stops. They had been real, and some of them were still alive. He glanced toward the man at the pool table, a heavy-set figure with a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man's eyes flicked to Daniel once, sharp and assessing, before turning back to his game. It was enough to make Daniel gather his things and leave, the logbook tucked firmly under his arm. The cold night air outside felt cleaner, but no safer. His car was parked under a flickering streetlight, and as he slid behind the wheel, he noticed another vehicle parked a short distance away, its engine running low and steady. The headlights didn't come on as he drove off, but when he checked his mirror, the vehicle pulled onto the road behind him. His pulse climbed. He pushed the accelerator gently, and the car behind him matched his speed. The narrow 2 lanes stretched out ahead, the trees pressing close on either side, and suddenly Daniel understood why his father had felt hunted. The night seemed to close in, the hum of the engine too loud in his ears. At the next turnoff, Daniel veered suddenly onto a dirt road, gravel spraying beneath his tires. He killed his headlights and rolled to a stop behind a stand of trees, heart hammering. Moments later, the vehicle cruised past the intersection, its taillights glowing briefly before disappearing into the dark. He sat in silence, his breath ragged, gripping the logbook as if it might anchor him. The pursuit confirmed what he already suspected: someone still cared about the secrets hidden in those pages, someone willing to follow him through the night to make sure they stayed buried. His father had written "Last Chance" in that book, and now Daniel understood. The warning wasn't only for himself, it was for anyone who dared to chase the truth after him. Daniel waited in the dark until the sound of the other vehicle faded into nothing. His breath was shallow, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as though letting go would invite the night to swallow him. The dirt road was silent, the forest pressing close around him, and for the first time he felt the full weight of what his father must have carried. John Ward had been followed, watched, shadowed by men who wanted to make sure his questions died on the road. Now, more than a decade later, those same shadows were stretching toward his son. When he finally restarted the engine, Daniel drove slowly, headlights low, until he reached the main highway again. He pulled into a truck stop just outside Pine Hollow, the kind that burned bright through the night, with rows of rigs lined up like sentinels. Inside, the air smelled of grease and coffee, and the steady murmur of truckers swapping stories filled the room. Daniel sat at the counter, trying to look like just another traveler. He opened the logbook discreetly, running his eyes over the pages. A man a few stools away glanced at it, and then at Daniel. "Old habits," the man said, with a faint smile, tapping his own worn notepad. "Don't see many young guys carrying those anymore." Daniel hesitated, then asked quietly if he had been on the road in the 80s. The man nodded, his expression hardening with memory. "Different time. Lot of good men out there, but a lot of bad business, too. Some runs you didn't ask about if you wanted to keep breathing." Daniel slid the logbook slightly toward him, pointing to Pine Hollow written on one of the pages. The man's face darkened. He shook his head and muttered, "Should have stayed clear of that place. Some drivers got pulled into things they never came back from." He looked directly at Daniel then, his gaze sharp. "If your old man was one of them, you need to understand you're digging in ground that's still dangerous." Daniel nodded, but the words only steeled his resolve. He folded the logbook closed and slipped it back into his jacket. His father had left this trail knowing it might be followed, and though the shadows of Pine Hollow pressed in, Daniel knew turning back was no longer an option. The truth was out there, and it was closing in on him as surely as those headlights had in the night. Daniel left the truck stop with the man's words echoing in his ears, the night air cold against his skin. The lot was alive with the rumble of diesel engines, headlights cutting across the asphalt as drivers prepared for another long stretch of road. He felt out of place, carrying not freight but questions, his father's logbook heavier than any cargo. Still, the warning he had just received only strengthened the resolve in his chest. His father hadn't died because of bad luck or a wrong turn. He had been caught in something deliberate, something orchestrated, and Daniel was getting closer to the heart of it. He drove back toward Pine Hollow at dawn, the first light of day spilling over the horizon and breaking through the trees. The town was even quieter in the morning, its streets nearly empty. He parked near the old post office, thumbing through the logbook again until he landed on the final entry where his father had circled the middleman's name. It seemed almost like a signature of fate, a final reminder of who held the answers. He asked around discreetly, stopping at a small cafe where locals nursed coffee over chipped mugs. Most shook their heads when he mentioned the name, but an older man seated near the window stiffened at the mention. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he stirred his cup. "You don't want to be asking about him," the man muttered, not looking up. "Scar on his face, mean eyes. Folks used to say he ran things out of the depot before it closed. Kept drivers in line. Your father," he stood out, because he wouldn't bow his head. Daniel pressed gently, asking if the man knew what became of him. The older man finally looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "He didn't disappear like the rest. He's still around. Lives just outside town on the old highway. People leave him be. Best you do the same." But Daniel knew he couldn't. His father's last words on paper had been desperate, carved into the logbook like a man trying to leave behind a map through the dark. If this scarred figure was still alive, then he might hold the final piece of the truth. As Daniel left the cafe, the morning sun casting long shadows across the street, he felt the pull of inevitability. The trail was leading him straight to the man his father had feared most. Daniel followed the directions given by the old man at the cafe, his car winding down a stretch of the old highway that cut through the woods like a scar of its own. The houses here were scattered and weather-beaten, their yards cluttered with rusting machinery and half-collapsed sheds. When he saw the place, he knew it before the mailbox confirmed it. The sagging farmhouse with its broken porch rail, the kind of property that looked as though time had turned its back on it. A lone pickup sat in the driveway, its paint faded, one headlight cracked. He pulled off to the shoulder, cutting the engine but leaving his hands resting on the wheel. His pulse drummed in his ears as he studied the house. The logbook lay on the passenger seat, open to the circled name. It had led him here, to this place, to the man his father had feared. The curtains twitched once, and Daniel knew he had been seen. Gathering his courage, he stepped out of the car and walked up the path. The porch creaked under his weight, and before he could knock, the door opened. A man stood framed in the doorway, older now but unmistakable. The scar above his brow ran deep, puckered like a brand. His eyes, cold and sharp, fixed on Daniel with a flicker of recognition that unsettled him. "You're John Ward's boy," the man said, his voice gravelly, almost amused. "I can see it in your face." Daniel swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "You knew my father. He wrote your name in his logbook before he disappeared. I want to know what happened to him." The man leaned against the doorframe, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Your father was stubborn, honest to a fault. He thought he could ask questions about things that weren't his concern. That's dangerous on the road, son. Some loads don't like daylight. And—" Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Did you kill him?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a silence so thick Daniel could hear the crows in the trees behind him. "You don't want those answers," he said finally. "The truth won't bring him back. It'll only put you where he ended up." Daniel felt the weight of the warning, but he stood firm on the porch, his father's handwriting etched into his mind. He hadn't come this far to turn back now. Daniel held his ground, the old boards groaning beneath his boots as the scarred man's words hung in the cold air. The house behind him seemed to breathe with silence, the kind of silence that had buried truths for years. For a moment neither of them spoke, and Daniel could feel the weight of history pressing down the final page of his father's story, waiting to be turned. "You can scare me all you want," Daniel said quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I've been chasing shadows for 12 years. My father deserves better than to vanish into nothing. I need the truth." The man's eyes narrowed, studying him like a puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. Then, with a slow exhale, he stepped aside. "Come in, then. If you're so determined to dig up ghosts, you'd better hear how they died." Inside, the air was thick with smoke and old wood. A single lamp cast weak light over a table cluttered with papers and empty bottles. The man lowered himself into a chair and began to speak, his tone flat, as though telling the story of someone else's life. He explained how the shipments had never been what they appeared, how John had suspected the truth and pressed too hard. He had warned John to keep quiet, but John had refused, determined to take his concerns higher. That refusal had sealed his fate. Daniel's stomach knotted as he listened, the confirmation he had feared finally spoken aloud. His father hadn't walked away, hadn't failed his family. He had been silenced because he would not bend. When the man finished, he leaned back, his scar catching the lamplight. "That's all there is to it. He was a good man. Too good for the kind of business we were in. That's why he didn't make it home." Daniel rose slowly, every muscle taut with the effort of keeping control. He wanted to lash out, to demand more, but he knew he had already heard the answer his father had left behind in fragments of ink and ash. As he stepped back out into the night, the logbook heavy in his hand, Daniel felt a strange mix of grief and resolve. The truth was cruel, but it was no longer hidden. His father's name would not remain a whisper in the dark. It was a story Daniel would carry, a trail he would finish, so that John Ward would never again be just another trucker who disappeared on the road.